I left off talking about the definition of God, which we say we can't define. But one of the definitions for God that all religions have is that God is love. Love is also something we can't define. But what we can say about love, which we could say about God, is that this is an experience. It's not just an experience, but it's an experience that we have conviction about. You know when you're in love. If you say, I don't know whether I'm in love or not, you're not. But it's not something that you can really put into words. And that's one of the basic characteristics of a mystical experience, is called ineffability. The experience transcends any kind of definition. I remember when I fell in love with my high school sweetheart, I remember looking at her and saying, I love you a lot. I love you very much. But what's a lot? What's very much? You know, I mean, it seems so inadequate, so you try to write poetry or something, but even the poetry doesn't quite do it, because it's something which transcends any kind of definition at all. But there must have been some point at which some primitive person looking at the reflection in a lake, in a pool, and wondered, what is this thing which is looking back at me? And not in the way that an animal might see the reflection, but not think about the reflection. So then there becomes this reflective thought. I mean, who is asking this question? Who is the looker? Who's observing? And what is it that you want to know more about? So we begin to come up with answers. And it's not surprising, therefore, that what we call tribal religion or shamanic religion finds a lot of answers in nature, that it's obvious that there are other things that are alive, that have spirits. They must have spirits, especially some things that are big animals, the elephant, the tiger, but everything is seen. One of the basic characteristics of what we call shamanism is animism. Animism simply means to animate, that everything is filled with life. So not just animals, but plants, and not just plants, but specifically sometimes giant trees, or then we can go beyond that to places, to rocks, to where two roads cross, to especially phenomenal outcroppings or something like that. And so people begin to worship in these areas, to sing, to chant, to dance, and some people, it seems, are a little bit more spiritual than others. By that I mean those who are given to going into trance-like states for whatever reason, and how primitive man actually begins to do things to bring on trance-like states, whether that's singing or chanting or dancing or hallucinogenic drugs, which we find accidentally. You know, you eat some mushroom or something that then you feel like your head is up there and you're talking to the gods, and so that all seems really, really important. Now, of course, shamanic religion is something that we've actually a bit of a growing interest in this now. Later in the term, Emily here will be sharing about Native American religious traditions of which she was a part for a good bit of time, and I'll let her tell you about that when the time comes. Of course, shamanic religions are dying, simply because as the world progresses and we develop more and more sophistication in electronics and technology, etc., and there are fewer and fewer places which are completely disconnected from, although there continue to be some amongst Aborigines, and there continue to be some amongst tribes in Venezuela and other places. And as I said, there's a growing interest in this as well, because people feel as though something is being lost and we want to try to preserve it. The next oldest religious tradition that we have really comes from the Hindu tradition and from the Jewish tradition. But particularly the oldest scriptures that we have are the Vedas, the Upanishads, the Bhagavad Gita, and what these are hymns. These are songs. It's really not surprising. There will be the same thing in the Jewish tradition as too, with the Psalms and Proverbs, etc. That the first thing that we have are things that got passed down orally. And what do you remember best that gets passed down orally? You remember songs, right? Which could be sung, which could be repeated over and over and over again in the course of generations before somebody begins to write them down. So the Rig Veda then really becomes, and there's several Vedas, we don't have time to go into all the different Vedas, but it just means a hymn. Interestingly, they were regarded as not having been written by anyone. We talk about the authors of the Vedas, but they were always regarded as divinely inspired or given, right? So it's interesting when we talk about the Course in Miracles, which is the most contemporary example of that. It was given. It wasn't something that was authored by a particular person. Mozart said that he did not write his sonatas, that they were given to him. Now, he had to know how to write music in order to be able to put them down. Some of you may know the story, but I'm not going to go into it. Ramanujan from India, who was this incredible mathematical genius back during the latter part of the 18th, early part of the latter part of the 19th, early part of the 20th century, who received all these mathematical formulas, which he wrote, none of which have ever been disproved, which he said were given to him. He didn't come up with them. He did no math, of course. It's a very interesting story. There's a film about his life that's called The Man Who Knew Infinity, who could only think in math. It's a very interesting kind of story. But that's what we mean by given. And very often, Lynn here's a poet. Any of the rest of you poets, I don't know, but very often when you get a poem, you will feel as though it's been given to you, that you did not make it up, but it was just like you heard. And then at the end of it, you just want to kind of go, thank you, for wherever you know, thank you. I don't know where that came from, but thank you for giving me this inspiration, right? And the word inspiration obviously means to be inspirited. The other thing from the Hindu tradition, the contributions it makes, it's really, as I said, our oldest religious tradition. Two of the most important concepts have to do with Maya, that is, to understanding that the world is an illusion or a dream. That is still true amongst native peoples in Venezuela and among the Australian Aborigines. But it's also true, and the idea of samsara, that the world is it's not only a dream, but it's also a place of sorrow, and also a place of suffering, and it's a place of suffering and sorrow insofar as even as we might sort of consider ourselves as being trapped in the world, trapped in bodies, that somehow or another the spirit is delimited into the form of a body, and really is seeking to transcend that somehow or another, if that was just possible to be able to do that. It's interesting, again, I can't talk without talking about A Course in Miracles, so that this is also one of the basic characteristics of the Course. It says your nighttime dream, your daytime dream has a different form, That's all. It's still a dream that's going on, which means that there's a process, a spiritual process that we're all engaged in of awakening. And it's interesting when we get around to the Buddha in around 500 BC. Who does the Buddha say that he is? He is awake. That's who he is. So he is self-realized, you know. And part of what he realizes is that it is a dream. You see the dream. He's learned to become, if you will, lucid dreamers, where we recognize the game, we recognize the play, we recognize the story, we see it for what it is. We don't become involved in it on some level, because we're able to kind of be able to transcend it and get to a higher. We have to live in it. There's not a choice about that, but we can live in it from a higher spiritual dimension. Right? We can see it for what it is, rather than just being trapped in it. The other basic contribution, even though Hinduism appears to be a very diverse religion in the sense of sees life in all kinds of dimensions and ways, there's literally thousands of different gods in Hinduism. I mean, by thousands, I mean there could be a god that's just the god of a local temple kind of thing. So it can get down to being that specific. But at the same time, there is the contribution of monotheism, in the sense that we're rarely recognizing that there is just one God, or it's not just one God, that there's one reality, and that one reality, again to keep in the course, is split into, fragmented into literally trillions of forms. So there's trillions of forms, but at the same time there's trillions of forms. There's only one truth. There's only one reality. In lieu of time, let me go on and talk about what's one of the next All the Three. I'm going to leave Judaism for Rabbi next week. Next month, Rabbi Stewart will be here, and I'll let him talk about that tradition more. First, let me point out, there was a very interesting thing happened, some of you may know, around 500 BC. Give or take a couple of hundred years, you know, like 700 to 200, but right about 500 BC. It's called the Axel period in history. Karl Jaspers, who was a theologian, is the first to really talk about this in some detail. But for some reason, right around 500 BC, several major events occur spiritually and philosophically speaking. We find Buddha and Mahavira, the founder of Jainism, both waking up in India. We find Pythagoras, Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle, and the other Greek philosophers in ancient Greece. We find in Judaism Ezekiel and Jeremiah and Hosea doing their talking. And in particular, the one who seems to start it all, well, sort of the oldest one, going back to around 600, maybe prior to 600 BC, is Zoroaster, who is really one of the kind of the world's first great philosophers in a certain sense, who comes up with the idea of Ahura Mazda, who is God, but also talks about the kind of split that seems to have occurred in consciousness, where it's very interesting. We talk about dualism and monism at the same time. By this, I mean there's a recognition that behind everything there's only one God, there's only one force, there's only one energy, there's only one truth. But that's not the way it looks in the world. You know, in the world, it looks as though there's two. It looks as though there's an evil force, or a dark force, or a split force, or divided force. In the Course, we would talk about that in terms of the ego. Now, one of the things that Hinduism recognized early on was that while that appears to be true, it's not real. It's really an illusion from which we seek to find some sort of transcendence. But you have to understand that it's not real. If you think that it's real and that there's a battle going on between forces of good and the forces of light, then we begin to get into a real problem. As long as we have a dualistic concept, then we're going to have wars. Then we're going to have one being right, one being wrong. Sometimes this can sort of be balanced out, but not always. Ultimately, we only get down to one. Yes, Patty?
Like when you get to the point where you love evil, you know, like in that book where, and with the Pinocchio chart and stuff, it's like when you love it, then it becomes real. You know what I mean? Like if you love the evil, then it becomes real, right? So isn't that a bad thing, or is that a good thing? Is that like giving it a choice to do whatever? Or is it like, because I thought loving it was good, but then it makes it real, right?
Now, ultimately, it's loving is recognizing that there's nothing there. That there's no, it's a false concept. It has no reality.
So the choices Viktor Frankl was talking about in his book, that's not real, the choice to choose.
The choice to choose is to choose the only choice which any of us ever have, which is to follow the will of God. In fact, I didn't mean to get off and talk about the Course here, but you can introduce it, so let me do it. No, it's okay. It's just, my wife and I were talking about this at dinner last night, so it comes up all the time. The basic problem we all have is the authority problem. So to talk about the authority problem is to say, am I going to do it God's way, or is there another way, which is my way? It's an independent way. I can go against the will of God. If I go against the will of God, however, what happens is inevitably that I wind up suffering. I wind up hurt. I wind up hurting myself because this goes back to Adam and Eve, back to leaving the garden, you know, that you can do something against God, that you can do something that God asked you not to do. The consequence of this is this icky experience that we call guilt, in which a lot of religion winds up talking about how do you get freedom from guilt. And the freedom from guilt is by forgiving yourself for having slipped and going ahead and doing the right thing, trying to find the way to do the right thing. I can say I'm not going to get through this before lunch, but let me just go a little bit more of it, then we'll pray. Around this 500 BC period, there's some other, in China, we find Lao Tzu and we find Confucius right at the same time. And I think it's very interesting. At this point, the split is not so obvious. It's not like good and bad. It's more like left brain and right brain thinking. Taoism tends to be very right brain. What Taoism says is go with the flow, let nature take its course, there's a natural way to do all things, look for how everything fits together, look for the synchronicity that exists in all things. Try to bring your own life in flow with the Tao. This is the way to be at peace and to know the truth. Confucianism, which happens right about the same time, is very left brain. It's completely opposite in some sense. It's saying, no, there's an order to things, there's a proper way to do things, we have to have laws, we have to have structure. There are relationships that are the right kind of there's a relationship that the son has with the father, that the subject has with the ruler, that the husband has with the wife has with the husband, and there's a way that this is to be observed. It's the symbol for Taoism, therefore, as you know, is the circle, which then has the two pieces, the dark and the light, and there's a little light and a dark, and there's a little dark and the light. There's a male and a female, and a female and the male. But the symbol for Confucianism, on the other hand, is like this stack of books. It's like you see in the I Ching, where we have it's square and it's rigid, and there's a form and there's a format that we, and actually both are true. It's like it's not that one is right, and the thing that's interesting that these two religions grew up in China at the same time, and were accepted. I mean, there were times, of course, when there were conflicts between the Confucians and the Taoists, but at the same time that was true, it somehow or another got accepted that it was okay that there were these two different approaches. Because if you think about it, it's kind of like looking in a mirror. And what I mean by looking in a mirror is when you look in a mirror, you're really seeing your reflection backwards. But it doesn't occur to you that you're seeing your reflection backwards. You're seeing the other side, but at the same time that you're seeing the other side, it's okay that you're seeing the other side. And you really kind of realize that somehow or another there must be an integration here. That at the same time, both of these things that can be true. You go with the flow, but there's also an order to things, right? And by observing the order, it helps us to be in the flow. It's sort of, you live in the world, you pay your taxes, you observe the speed limit. I mean, I'm talking about in contemporary terms, you do what the law says, but at the same time, you learn, well, one of the basic principles really of both Taoism and Confucianism is kindness, right? So you learn that to be kind, that's the further step. As religion evolves, it becomes progressively more kind. It's interesting that there's in Zoroastrianism, for example, we know Zoroastrianism is really old. There's a big debate as to how, we don't know how old Zoroastrianism is in a certain sense. We're saying around 600 BC or 700 BC. It may be older than that. But there's a mention of Alexander the Great as having been around about 300 years prior to that in the Avestas and in the books. So if you look at that, then and Alexander the Great is around 300 BC. Okay, so that's one way that we can sort of date this, that is already was well in the past, that event, as far as the Zoroastrians were concerned, because he came through there, right? Well,
I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with numbers again.
Okay.
It says 1150 Zoroastrian.
Well, I'm saying it could be that old. I just double checked this yesterday to do some research on this, and sometimes it goes back further than 1150, but anywhere up to 600 or 700. It's really difficult to get a date in here. There's no agreement among scholars. But what it seems to be happening is it just seems to keep, the more we find out, the further the date goes back. Right, just keep pushing it, so maybe as early as 1150. Okay. I'm running out of time. We do want to stop for lunch.